Have you ever stopped to wonder why almost everyone you know reaches for a pen, a fork, or a phone with the same hand? And why that hand is almost always the right one? Here's a number that should stop you in your tracks. Across every culture, every continent, every era of recorded history, about 90% of humans are right-handed. And that ratio has barely budged in thousands of years. That's strange, because in the rest of the animal kingdom, handedness, or pawedness, if you want to call it that, is usually split roughly 50-50. Cats favor one paw or the other almost randomly. Chimpanzees show some preference, but nothing close to a 90% skew. So, somewhere in our evolutionary story, something happened that pushed the vast majority of our species toward the right side. And today we're going to dig into what that something actually was, because the answer touches on our brains, our ancestors, our tools, and even the way we learn to talk to each other. So, stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll never look at your own hand the same way again. Let's start with the most obvious suspect, the brain. Because your hands aren't actually in charge, your brain is. And here's the wild part. The two sides of your brain are not mirror images of each other in function. The left hemisphere, for most people, is the control center for language, for fine motor planning, for sequencing complex movements. And because of the way our nervous system is wired, the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. So, if the left brain became the dominant hub for precise, sequential tasks, it makes sense that the right hand, its direct line of control, became the dominant hand too. Scientists believe this connection between language and handedness isn't a coincidence at all. In fact, some researchers argue that the same brain circuitry humans evolved to produce complex speech, with its rapid, sequential, highly coordinated muscle movements in the mouth and throat, is closely related to the circuitry needed to perform complex, sequential hand movements, like crafting a tool or throwing a spear with accuracy. So, as our ancestors' brains got better at stringing together the sounds that became language, they may have simultaneously gotten better at stringing together the movements that became skilled, one-handed tool use. And because both of these abilities were being managed by the same hemisphere, the left one, the right hand came along for the ride. And this leads us to one of the oldest and most compelling theories out there, the tool use theory. Because think about what early humans actually needed to survive. They needed to make stone tools, sharp enough to cut through hide, and precise enough to butcher meat efficiently. And making a stone tool is not a simple task. It requires one hand to hold the stone steady, while the other hand strikes it with careful, controlled, repeated blows at just the right angle. And if you've ever tried to do anything that requires that kind of fine motor precision, you know it's incredibly hard to be equally good at it with both hands. Your brain essentially has to pick one hand to specialize in, because trying to split that skill evenly between both sides would mean neither hand gets good enough. So, anthropologists who've studied ancient tools, some going back over 1.5 million years, have found something fascinating. The wear patterns and strike marks on these tools suggest that the tool makers were predominantly right-handed, and this tells us that our preference for the right hand isn't some recent cultural quirk. It's ancient. It's baked into the story of how we became human in the first place. And here's where it gets even more interesting, because once a group of early humans started favoring the right hand for tool making, there would have been a real survival advantage to teaching that same preference to the next generation. Because a community where everyone uses the same hand for the same tasks can share tools more easily, teach skills faster, and coordinate group activities more efficiently. Imagine trying to learn how to throw a spear from someone who used the opposite hand from you. It would be confusing. It would slow down learning. And in a world where learning fast could mean the difference between eating dinner and going hungry, a shared hand preference across the group would have been quietly, powerfully useful. And this brings up another theory that a lot of researchers find compelling, the social and cultural reinforcement idea. Because handedness isn't purely genetic, it's shaped by the environment too. For centuries, in many cultures around the world, including right here in the West, left-handedness was actively discouraged, sometimes brutally so. Children who naturally favored their left hand were forced to switch, tied to chairs, scolded, punished, all because right-handedness became associated with correctness, with normalcy, even with morality. The very word right in English means both a direction and a synonym for correct, while the word sinister, which now means evil or threatening, comes directly from the Latin word for left. And that's not a coincidence. That's thousands thousands of years of cultural bias baked directly into our language. So, even if genetics gave humans a natural lean toward the right hand, culture cranked that lean up even further by punishing the alternative. But let's back up, because genetics really is a huge piece of this puzzle. Scientists have identified several genes that appear to influence handedness, though it's not as simple as one gene deciding it all. It's more like a complex mix of genetic factors that nudge the odds one way or the other. And here's a fascinating detail. If both of your parents are left-handed, you actually have a higher chance of being left-handed yourself compared to the general population. But even then, most children of two left-handed parents still end up right-handed, which tells us that genetics sets up a probability, not a guarantee. And interestingly, identical twins who share the exact same DNA don't always share the same hand preference, which means something else is going on too. Something happening in the womb during brain development that isn't purely coded in our genes. And this is where things get genuinely mysterious, because researchers have found that handedness may actually begin before birth. Ultrasound studies have shown that fetuses show a preference for sucking their right or left thumb as early as 15 weeks into pregnancy, long before any baby could possibly be influenced by culture or parenting. And remarkably, that early thumb preference tends to predict which hand the child favors, years later after birth. So, something in early brain development, some asymmetry in how the nervous system wires itself up, is already tilting the odds before a baby ever takes its first breath. And scientists are still trying to fully understand what triggers this. Some point to asymmetries in the spinal cord itself, not just the brain, suggesting handedness might be determined even earlier and more fundamentally than we ever imagined. And this actually connects to a bigger, almost breathtaking idea about human evolution as a whole, because that same left brain hemisphere that controls the right hand and manages language is also deeply involved in something called sequential processing, the ability to plan out a series of steps in the correct order and execute them smoothly. And think about how much of what makes humans unique relies on exactly that skill. Cooking a meal requires sequential steps. Building a shelter requires sequential steps. Even telling a story with a beginning, middle, and end requires sequential processing. So, some scientists believe that right-handedness isn't really the main event at all. It's a side effect, a visible symptom of a much deeper evolutionary shift in how the human brain organizes complex behavior. In other words, we didn't evolve to be right-handed for its own sake. We evolved brains that got incredibly good at planning and sequencing, and right-handedness is simply the fingerprint that shift left behind on our bodies, which honestly reframes this whole topic, doesn't it? Because now the question isn't just why do we favor one hand, the question becomes what does our hand preference reveal about the incredible complexity of the human brain? And that's a much bigger, much more fascinating question. And it's worth remembering before we wrap up that left-handed people aren't some evolutionary mistake or a glitch in the system. In fact, some researchers argue there are real advantages to being left-handed in certain contexts. In one-on-one combat sports like boxing or fencing, left-handed competitors have a statistical edge simply because most opponents have trained against right-handed fighters their whole lives and aren't used to the different angle of attack a left-handed fighter presents, which is sometimes called the fighting hypothesis, suggesting that left-handedness has persisted in the human population, generation after generation, precisely because in a world with more right-handed people, being the unexpected minority sometimes gave you a very real edge. So evolution didn't eliminate left-handedness, it preserved it at a stable, small percentage, because a little unpredictability in a population can actually be a survival advantage. And when you step back and look at the whole picture, the honest answer is no single theory fully explains why humans became mostly right-handed. It's genetics nudging the odds before we're even born. It's brain architecture linking language and hand control in the same hemisphere. It's ancient tool-making demanding one dominant, precise hand. It's culture reinforcing, and even punishing, the alternative for centuries. And it's the strange advantage of staying a minority that kept left-handedness alive, despite all of that pressure. And maybe that's the most human answer of all, because so much of what makes us who we are, our bodies, our habits, our quirks, comes from this same tangled mix of biology, environment, and history, all pulling in different directions at once. So the next time you pick up a coffee cup, sign your name, or throw a ball without even thinking about which hand to use, remember, you're carrying a decision that was shaped over 1,000,000 years, written into your brain before you were even born. And if that doesn't make you look at your own hands a little differently, I don't know what will. So if you found this as fascinating as I did, hit subscribe. Because there's a lot more about the hidden science behind everyday human behavior coming your way. And I'll see you in the next one.